done in that length of time. You have two handouts right now. This one, if you'll notice, says page 2 of 23. Well, here's the 23. And I didn't make handouts of this, but Bill is putting all of these files that support this, and I'll pass it around and he'll tell you where those will be located, and Holly will send that out to everybody. But this is a handout. The handout is different than the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint enhances what's in the handout, as does this. And so the PowerPoint will also be made accessible to you. The little green survey that's on here that you have, I want those back. It's kind of old school, but it ties in some pretty salient points as we do this presentation. So I'll hand this to Bill. He can pass this around so you can see what's going to be on the website. Let's get started, because this is absolutely critical to what we do in ALEC. And I will say that, well, that doggone Kevin, you misled everybody. You said we were going to do a presentation on theoretical frameworks. We're not. See what the title up there says? Yeah. And I did this on purpose. And those of you that heard me talking with Dr. Christensen before this session started, there are several kinds of frameworks. The theoretical frameworks and conceptual frameworks, those are pretty core, pretty basic setups. And actually Bill Cochran is a master at frameworks, because all frameworks are real simple. It's telling your story. That's what a framework does. It tells your story and how you fit within the story. The actual, underneath that, the actual operational framework, and we'll get into specifics on that, is actually the action that you are doing in terms of your framework. One of the things that's very important to me is I will not sit on any committee, any graduate committee, unless you have a framework and you embrace this, because this is the core and it's the largest efficiency of anything we do in ag education. So we're going to start by looking at this. If you'll turn to the last page of your survey, and you can share there. This framework comes directly from that survey. And I think on that last couple of pages, it has some of those items in there. It has education, whether it's formal, non-formal. So that's a section. It has personal characteristics, has participation in these activities. And down at the bottom, the questionnaire ahead of that, I believe, is about 80 questions. 40 that deal with knowledge and 40 that deal with opinions. So we're going to use this questionnaire, and whether you use SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics or anything that we do now, it's all the same process. And that is, do we make this stuff up, or is there rationale for why these boxes are the way they are, and why we have the arrows pointed the way the arrows are pointing. And so we're going to start off by doing this. Uh-oh. There it is. So this actually says it's a conceptual framework. And maybe it's wrong. It's actually an operational framework, because it fits within a larger conceptual or theoretical framework as it relates to education. We'll keep coming back to this and that little survey as we progress through this presentation. This is something that came out of tech a few years ago. And just from those three words, theoretical, conceptual, operational framework, what would you call this framework just from the very introduction of what we've done here today? We'll get into more of this as we progress to it. So Lauren, of those three words, conceptual, theoretical, operational, what kind of framework is this? Do you see any theories? No, no theories.
No, I would say it's operation. Either conceptual or operational.
Okay,
Obviously,
and
because they
we'll
don't do
continue to work on the delineation between those two. It's
that. I
actually,
would just say if it's tested, then maybe it's conceptual.
it's what?
If it's been tested and like proven, you could say it's conceptual. Like if they have data to back that up, if those things affect that.
So we're going to delineate among theoretical, conceptual, and operational frameworks. And that one, actually, when we come back to it, it's conceptual, because you're not going to look at all of that. You probably look at one or two of those chunks of that. So here's a definition that I borrowed from Rama, from Penn State, and you can read that as well as I can. It's essentially that. It's a model. Model. Dylan McKim, tell me why understanding things like we do in research as a model is important.
Well, if you want to secure funding for a project, they want to make sure it's conceptually and theoretically sound, and procedurally your approach to it's appropriate. And unless they're comfortable with that and it's grounded in some form of empirical framework, they're not going to fund your project.
And that's a good answer. And I wouldn't say we do it because of funding, but the other things you said, we do it because research-wise, it's a sound way to approach things. Much of what we do in the research in this field, in ag leadership, education, and communications, is I have an idea. Somebody comes to me with an idea, I go, so what? How does it fit in the bigger picture? What am I asking you to do, Kate? I'm asking you to do a model, do a framework. Show me how it fits into something larger. And so that's the rationale for this. And actually, Dr. McKim is right. If you're going to attempt to get any funding from IDS, as an example, don't go in there unless it ties into a framework or a model. So frameworks. The handout that I gave you talks about this. I like frameworks for you, the grad student, for this very reason. If you come in with these grandiose ideas, and I'm going to do all of this in my graduate study, we as professors, Dr. Murphy and I, at least, attempt to help you focus. So this, in some ways, protects you and kind of starts the contract situation, if you will, between you, your committee, and the kind of work you're going to do. This is probably what Dr. McKim was trying to say. The modeling, the framework that you do helps demonstrate this importance to your audiences. Some folks will say, well, these things don't matter in qualitative research. And they do. They matter even more so in qualitative research, because in qualitative research, in many ways, you're actually building your frameworks. You might have some frameworks that you find in the literature, and you're going to hear the word literature time and time and time again in this presentation. So in qualitative research, you're learning from your participants, and you're starting to build these trends. Things emerge from the data and so on. And so your framework locations in qualitative, in your chapter 1, you're looking at how you're orienting your study. You have these ideas that you've seen from other researchers. You generally don't go into any research as a blank slate. You go in with some ideas. Those ideas need to be founded in the literature. In chapter 2, in your qualitative studies, this is where you start developing your theory that you're going to be looking at, that you're going to be studying. And then in chapter 5, in qualitative studies, this is where you bring your work from chapter 1 with your work from chapter 2. You compare, contrast, and basically you come up with the Bill Cochran theory of whatever it is you're studying in terms of qualitative study. most of this presentation is going to be surrounded around the conceptual framework components as they relate to quantitative research. So, in this particular study, or this presentation, there's your dependent variable primary. This is one of the main components. Where is the dependent variable in this framework right here? Kevin?
The bottom, the knowledge base and opinions.
Okay, is there one or two?
Two.
There are two. One for knowledge, one for opinion. Pretty easy. So all frameworks, and we have a worksheet we'll do for your particular interest here in a minute, but all frameworks have arrows that go a certain direction. And they don't always have to go one way. There's usually interface. Things can be cyclic. But it's all done on purpose. In this particular study, pretty simple study, is a master's study, the person wanted to see what influences the knowledge base and opinions. In this case, he was looking at university instructors, and that was kind of interesting. A second main component are variables of influence, or characteristics if you're not doing a quasi-study. So in this particular case, where are our variables of influence in this particular framework? Raise your hand if you have an idea. Where are your variables of influence? Which of these boxes would be those variables that you think maybe this researcher was interested in looking at? And again, we're looking at this one here, the variables of influence, or your intervening variables, your action variables.
It'd be the remaining three, looking at what their education was, then how their personal characteristics and their participation affects
These
their
ones here.
knowledge base and opinion.
Okay. And without knowing the way it was set up, you could argue that. And without knowing how this was set up, you could also argue this here, participation. And I actually forget which way it was at this point in time. I think we were looking at these influences actually over here, where the participation in these areas, and that kind of had some interesting results. If you're an FFA or 4-H, you think you would have a better knowledge base. That was the theory. That was what we postulated. So, the other third component of most frameworks are these, your extraneous variables or characteristics. And in this particular case, if this is our dependent variable, that's our intervening variable, then it makes sense that these education and personal characteristics would be our extraneous variables. So, if you look at this, pass those around. This is the way that you can initially start looking at frameworks and studies that you're looking at. You have your all independent variables are on this left side, and you have four different independent variables. You have your variables of influence, moderator, control, intervening on the left side. You have one over on the right side for your dependent variables. So as you think about your study, fill in those blanks. Just go, what is it I'm looking at? And take 2 or 3 of these if you want. Much like most studies, you have more than one influence. So again, I stole this from Rama, Brian Myers from Florida, Maria Navarro from Georgia. Those are 3 other what I consider framework experts in the profession. So if you know any of them, you can run your frameworks by them. They're really outstanding in this area. So, the components. In addition to having those dependent and independent type variables, one of the key things, there it is again, right here. Review of literature. You think the review of literature is important? Absolutely. Here's one thing never to tell me. Never come in and say, Dr. Elliot, there's no literature about my topic. Never ever come in and tell me that. Because that means one thing very clearly, that you don't know where to look. Because the way a framework is set up, there are a lot of places to go look for literature, and if you will have something that is so incredibly unique, then that's an operational framework, and it has to fit within a conceptual or theoretical framework. So the relationships among and between the variables is the most important part. So let me tell you something about folk psychology. How many people in this room have a mother? You all do, right? And do mothers have opinions? Do they? Okay. Are those opinions always well-founded? And we love our mothers.
Absolutely.
Yes. I visited my mom a couple weeks ago, and she doesn't change. My mother, over 80 years old, she has an opinion on everything. That's called a narrative as it relates to folk psychology. Folk psychology, the simple premise is this. It isn't so much the knowledge that separates a novice from an expert. It's understanding the relationships. So these guys over in biochemistry, basically, people in this room have the basics of biology, the basics of chemistry. You know, because those don't change. The periodic table is the periodic table. The basics of biology are the basics of biology. What they do understand are those relationships and how they tie together at a much higher level than what we do. And that's why conceptual frameworks are important. So in this particular study that Texas Tech did, where would, without being an expert in frameworks, where are the relationships? Where would they be visualized on this particular graphic? Raise your hand if you think you have an idea. Yep. Well, let's ask this. Where's the dependent variable in this one? Oh, the arrows are pointing at it. So it's in the middle. Travis, what are the relationships?
With the independent variables or all the stuff around it.
Okay. But if you had to visualize, where is a specific relationship, how would that be illustrated on here?
Facilities and technical, yeah, the arrows going into the like, for example, like facilities and technical support staff, that has the effect on the.
What's the effect? The effect is illustrated, and this is important. The effects that you're trying to look at in your study are illustrated by the arrows and the direction of the arrows. In this particular one, now think about this. Could the arrow go both ways?
Yes.
It could. But if the study is set up that they're only going to look at it going this way, then that's also important. So when we go back to this and we move forward, the essentials of the framework are different than the components. So the essentials of understanding frameworks is this. This goes back to the very, very beginning, Bill. This is what Bill Cochran does every night. Tells stories, reads stories to his children. He's a good dad. This, if you get anything, if you can only take one thing from today's presentation, it is this. It is the research framework, whether theoretical or conceptual, tells how your work fits in the bigger picture. It is your story. Let's see what we've got here. So, look at this for just a second. and see if you can tell me what this story is. What is the story that this researcher is trying to share with this framework?
I mean, pretty much, I think what he's trying to say is each one of those things influences each additional part, but ultimately, by them all working together, it affects that last, I can't really tell it. It's like something
Patronage
that-
behavior. You know what that really means?
What you got.
How much you spend and where. And this actual study was done at the very, very beginning of the online shopping. And so they were trying, all these retailers were working with us trying to figure out, is this online shopping thing going to become something? And so there it is. This was a model set up to look at that. And guess what they found? Yeah, it's going to. That's a kind of, we look at that now and go, that's a no-brainer. This is probably the second most important thing. Can I use the word? The words I'm sick and tired or something? That's okay. I am sick and tired of looking at literature reviews and they're gobbledygook. They're just stuff. You know, you can buy stuff at the Dixie Chicken. They have it on the menu. Anybody ever bought stuff at the Dixie Chicken?
That's good stuff.
Pretty good. It's like nachos on steroids. That's stuff. If I were to tell you that your literature review is stuff, that's not a good thing. Here's what you need to do. In this particular framework, this particular study, look at me. There are 4 sections in Chapter 2 in the literature review. Tell me what those sections are. There are 4, basically, categories in the literature review. What are those 4 categories? What are they called?
You mean for, oh.
There's a section on,
It's on the variables, I mean, pretty much.
Yeah.
Explaining the background and.
there
basis
should
of the
not
variables.
be a literature review with no headings. So maybe that's a better way to ask the question. So Holly, what are the headings in our literature review?
What would be the headings of each one of those boxes? So personal characteristics.
Make up. You're going to have a heading that says this. You're going to have a heading that says this, and that, and science achievement. And probably, maybe in that order, although if this is what you're really looking at, you might have the science achievement first, and then you could, from that, you would have these other areas. You'd say, well, we think that the hypothesized influences, these things are going to have the biggest influence on this, but we know from the research that personal and school characteristics also influence, and those are extraneous variables, and all of a sudden, your Chapter 2, your literature review has structure. I never want to say that your literature review, your Chapter 2, is just stuff. So now, I'm going to ask Holly to go to the whiteboard, and we're going to start putting stuff up there as it relates to Chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and use the associated colored pens. And in Chapter 2, write the word literature review, because guess what? That's your literature. That's where your literature review goes. And underneath that, put headings equal categories, or let's do it this way. Headings equal framework categories. And while she's doing that, we'll move forward. So, here's another. Where are your objectives in your study? What chapter? What chapter are your objectives in? Your research objectives? Is that the only place they are?
No.
Where else
Where
are
you
they?
say them in your methods also.
Where?
In your methods and also in your conclusions.
Some people actually put them in all 5 chapters. Normally, they so in chapter 1, and look at this. Again, this goes on as bad as saying your literature review is stuff. I will ask you if your objectives were made up. Because you don't have to have them in 2. Keep them there, but put them in parentheses. And parentheses means they come. Those objectives emerge from your literature review. Chapter 3, then, they go there. Chapter 4, they go there because of your results. And then chapter 5, you come back and talk about it. And so, Kate, you might have to help her. So, you'd get another pen, and you draw a connecting line to all of those objectives. Framework essentials, some other things. Oh my, look at this. Now we get in operational framework. An operational framework. So let's look at this one. Everybody take a look at this. This is something called essential skills. In Texas now we call them what, Dr. Murphy? Texas.
Essential knowledge and skills.
Something like that, okay? And the theory is, the model is, you do all of these things and at the bottom you get this, a high school diploma. And most of those state essential skills are built without this in mind. And this is something we think is pretty important. So, we're back to, is this theoretical, conceptual, or operational? Raise your hand if you have an answer. This framework. This is set by the state. It's okay if you're wrong.
I think it's operational.
Good question. Good answer. Let's take a look and see what I think it is. It's actually is. But let's see what part of it is. Because, again, you don't know the study. You just know what it is. So, this whole thing is a conceptual framework. This little chunk right here, from Ag Ed to science to over here, is actually what they study, Lauren. So that becomes the operational. And we'll see a visualization of that here in a minute. So here's conceptual. This circle here is then operational. And that's what's kind of critical on this, is that you have to tell me, oh, I want to look and I want to study about the science influence that we do in Ag Ed. And I go, so what? Who cares? Where's it fit? This then becomes, when you come and show me, you say, well, look at Ag Ed influences all of these. There's vocational competencies, language arts, free enterprise, and science. You put math in here. You want those kind of things. But what we're going to do, we're going to say, this is the state model. We're studying this part right here. So that's an essential. Another essential, this is really critical. You're hearing some nevers. Another never is I never want you to come in and say, oh, I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm a quantitative researcher. In fact, I was talking to the director of AgriLife Research 2 days ago. He's told me the same thing without even asking. He says, I don't care. What he does want to hear is, I'm a good researcher. By doing a good framework, it not only manages, it helps direct the kind of research you design. And that's one of the things Dr. McKim learned when he's been doing his quasi-experimental workshops and some of those kind of things. And this is also critical. I really don't want to hear, oh man, I found this really cool instrument, and I want to do my dissertation with this instrument. No. Your framework, the research that you do that puts it all together, should lead you to a good instrument, or an instrument that you modify. The instrument shouldn't direct what you do. Should never direct what you do. Does that make sense, Dr. Murphy? Am I way off base on that one?
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. So your framework helps you. It's all tied back to that literature review. Locations. Okay, back to the board. Your theoretical conceptual framework is at the end of chapter 2. You've got your categories, your headings, your 3 or 4 headings, maybe 5, doesn't matter. And you've talked about all of the stuff that supports this framework, and at the very end of chapter 2, you have an illustration, and you include, then, Holly, this. You tie everything together. This is a synthesis of those categories. You tie them together, and you help lead the reader on why these are important. So you think about the little study we're looking at. Doesn't it make sense if you're wanting to know if people have a knowledge base of agriculture, that their personal characteristics have an influence? Yeah, and so you tie that together. At the very beginning, and this synthesis becomes then a transition that leads to this. And that is located at the beginning of chapter 3. Your operational framework is missing or misconstrued in almost every study.
Or after my objective.
It can be, you can just write it up there. It's at the very beginning of chapter 3, and you can have some transitional paragraphs ahead of that as well. But what you have done is you've said, this conceptual or theoretical framework is how the world sees my problem. I can't do the whole problem. I can't solve it. What I can do is this. I can take, in that study we just looked at, they just looked at the science competencies of ag. And you're going to see some other examples here in a minute. Where are those located, Holly? Chapter 3, right? And so that operational framework evolves directly into your methods. In fact, it almost dictates what your methods are going to be. It actually gets into that and says, why are you doing this study without doing some qualitative, some triangulation, some multi-analysis? So at the beginning of this, it's tied directly to that. And now, since Kate, you've got the red pen, you take your pen and you draw a line from procedures right back to literature review. There we go. Thanks. And you draw a line from theoretical framework down at the bottom up to operational framework. There you go. Thank you. You can be like,
You don't bite or something.
uh-oh, what is this scratch? Chicken scratch. Holy smokes. Did I need to have this in here? Yes, I did. You know what this is? Who has an idea what this is? Anthony, what is this?
It's a map.
Yeah. And you know what it is? It's kind of the brainstorming. watch this. I'm going to show you 5 slides very quickly. It's the same study. This was when the grad student came into my office and said, I want a da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so I started talking. I started saying, okay, what about, have you looked at this? Have you looked at this? And what we're doing is trying to figure out, just from our knowledge base, what the young woman should be looking at for the lit review. And so I said, okay, go look at these things and see what happens. Came back with this. And so I said, okay, let's look at this. Are all of these things in there, these categories within your lit review? What are the current relationships? What are the proposed possible relationships? How does it work? You can see this is just straight my notes, but I kept these to show you that frameworks are hard to do. You don't just sit down and do one. You have to take time. This one took either 5 or 6 iterations. We'll see. This is number 2. Here's number 3. So we're still looking at it this way. We're looking at it top to bottom, and you're going to see how this evolves. So then she starts looking at what's happening in the state, starts building up her lit review, starts saying, oh, there's a line through this. That's not really where it really goes. These things kind of direct, so they went up there. And we're looking at these other things, and she's studying more, reading more. Number 4 is starting to take shape. And now it's much more, like we said in the beginning, simplified. It's starting to simplify now. This is what we're looking at. The last one, and the one you've seen already, and the one we used, took it from this downward movement to a sideways movement. Because we finally started saying, it makes better sense coming at it from this direction, because whether we like it or not, Ag Ed is out of the mainstream in most states. It's always kind of here, CTE. People don't see it as essential. We're trying to demonstrate that it is essential, and so studies like this are what are critical to make that happen. And so, as we showed you before, conceptual, this becomes then the operational, and so it makes it for a nice study. This one, we said, is operational, and we said 4 areas. Put the wrong part on the thing. Okay, so this one, we said there's one of your sections. There's your second section, third section, fourth section in your lit review. So now, these next 5 slides, again, I stole from Rama. And we're going to look at this particular framework for a few minutes. Look at these and see if they make sense to you. These are factors in whatever this study is. And we're looking at a sustainability idea and the formation of groups. In this particular case, it's farmer groups, farmer associations. They have a greater need. Or it could be something like co-ops or things like that, lobbying power, some of those things. And they're saying that these factors here, social, financial, human, and natural, influence whether a group forms or not. So keep in mind those 4 things in this group as we move forward. So the research questions, yes, sir?
Can you go back to the vertical slide really quick with the conceptual and operational? I want to make sure I understand this. So the one more. So the ones on the left are like the skills that everyone thinks are like accepted.
And then the conceptual is the whole thing.
Okay.
Not just that column. Conceptual is the whole map.
Okay.
The whole slide. The operational, what you would do in chapter 3 is you would take just this part and say, this is what I'm studying. And you would have that separate. I'm sorry.
And explain why you're hence operational.
And that leads to your methodologies and those other kind of things.
So the whole map
How
is the
science
world.
competencies
The
Yes.
red
influence
section
that
is
whole
not
map.
ours.
Your
The red
operational
section is your study. Yes. Great question. So now we'll look at this one, looking at farmer groups. And so as we move forward, there are 4 questions. And you can see they're tied directly to what we just looked at. Demographics, what are the group formation factors, what knowledge, and how the demographics are related to the group formation. And so, again, these next 5 slides are all the same study. So if we look at it from this perspective, remember these 4 questions, and where do they fit within the framework? So what I'm going to ask you to do, if I'm ever on any of your committees, is in your framework, I'm going to have you point to the arrows or the lines, and you tell me where your research questions are located. There's research question 1. It's in that box. We need to know the demographics. Research question 2 is the arrow that goes from those factors to group formation. Research question 3 is the one from knowledge. And the last one are the demographics to group formation. Let's make sure we're right. Let's just focus on research question number 4. From demographics to group formation. Is that right? Demographics to group formation. It's right. And so now, what are research questions? Where are they located? Put them right under objectives, because generally they're in chapter, actually in chapter 1, sometimes in 2, sometimes in 3. But generally you go from your objectives to your research questions. And this shows you how important it is. And now draw a line from that down to your framework. There you go. Because your framework should be clear on where those research questions, oh, it's a blue line, but that's, we'll let it go. Your research questions should be clearly identifiable within your operational framework, which this is. And actually, I did that wrong. That needs to go up to the operational framework, that research question. Yeah. So, there they are. And this is the reason why. Remember the relationship thing? This is what it's all about. Anything that's on an arrow is generally a correlation, relationship, tied into those type of things. Over here, your demographics for research question 1 is just knowledge. It's just, you know, what is the demographic? What are the demographics of your study? And so this would be independent variables to dependent variables. Research question 1, 2, 3, and 4. 2, 3, and 4 are relationships. I mean, 2, 3, and 4 are relationships. Research question 1, that's your demographics. Kind of going fast on this. Questions before we move on? How many of you are doing correlational study? Do you know?
Well, I was going to ask, if you make an operational framework and you're looking at different factors influencing something, but you're doing more descriptive, you're not really looking at correlation, can you still put the arrows in there even though you're not assessing that yet?
You need to, you wouldn't necessarily have the arrows, but you'd have the categories, the characteristics. So looking back at this one, we call this a theoretical framework, because in this particular case, they're testing this guy's theory. This guy, Darden, proposed this model. So that's his theory. Dr. McKim is actually working on a modified IAS, Integrated Analysis System model. Question, what type of model is this? Theoretical, conceptual? Raise your hand if you think it's, we'll do it this way. Raise your hand if you think it's theoretical. Raise your hand if you think it's conceptual. You have to make a decision. This is actually a research framework. So it's a different. None of you are right. It's actually a framework for education in terms of looking at it. So you could call it conceptual. What do you think this is?
Hot mess.
It's a mess.
Hot mess.
This is a mess.
That's tough.
I just completed this 6-year study out in Arizona with the Northern Arizona Technological District. It's what we call the NAVIT study. And the woman and I that I was working with, we grappled with the framework. We fought. We tried to figure something out, and guess what? We did. Instead of circles, we did triangles. And everything we wanted to study fits in a box. So in this one, we're looking at CTE, and workforce, college, and the NAVIT district. And those were the influences of the people that were paying for the study. And it worked for us. They liked that model. It's a conceptual framework. This one, guy did this framework out at Iowa State. Very colorful. And you can see on the left side, problems, explanation, assumptions. Put a lot of thought into it. Looking at from non-participation to engagement. How do you influence people? People do not participate because of da-da-da-da-da, based on our... He did a lot of work on this. Man, PhD. Here's this conceptual framework for looking at labor market stuff. I worked on this study at the National Center when I was there. So and here's the Texas Tech one we've looked at a couple times. We call it conceptual. Now I'm going to take a conceptual model and put from it, and this is where you need to go between chapter 2 and 3. This conceptual model, looking at the decision point when you graduate from high school, whether you go to college, work, other combinations, and whether it's related to your training or in this case, your career and technical education area. And so we couldn't get all of these variables, but conceptually we said they were important. The research said that. So on the right side ends up being the actual operational model. So all of these things come directly from there, but these were the actual variables in each one of these boxes that we looked at. So down here, if you look at the decision point, the only one we looked at was work, training or non-training related. So we went down here and we just looked at this part. We didn't look at college, we didn't look over here, we just looked at that. That then shows you the relationship of what the world could be, what you could study, but this is what you did. And that's the difference between a conceptual, theoretical, and an operational framework. We just didn't have access to all of that. But these are the actual variables that we were able to get. And then we looked only at this dependent variable. Questions on this? So, let's look at this one, kind of watch it build. Be thinking, what type of framework is this? Smoking status of you. You are or you aren't. Attitudes toward school, race, all these kind of things, GPA, type of tobacco. What's this kind of framework? Miranda?
Conceptual.
How'd you know that?
That's theory.
There's no theory, and there's quite a bit. You could argue that if the study was huge, it could still even be operational. But in this particular case, it is conceptual. So let's look at this one. Just looking at a couple things on the advancement of women to the top. What would you think then, Lauren? Pretty simple.
Operation.
Yeah. This one's an operational framework. And you can
Just
imagine
looking
a
at
bigger,
one or
what's
two-
that?
Because you're just looking at one or two things. I mean,
Right.
there's so many other variables that there could be.
Uh-oh, riddle me this. Can you have more than one operational framework in a study?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, you can, depending on the scope of your study. You can take, like ag example, that ag example, you could look at science, and you could look at math. And you could have a framework for each of them in your operational, because that's what you study, that's what you conducted. Hygiene factors. Dr. Bowen, Lanny Bowen helped conduct this one. He's now the provost at Penn State. I wonder what he would call this one. You think?
Operational?
Good job. Because this is actually, again, operational generally is kind of tighter stuff that you just go, yeah, they can get that information. So, going back to this, originally it was listed as conceptual. It's actually operational, because this was the study. So let's look at your blank sheets. And each of you right now, take, if you would humor us, think about your study and put in what you think your dependent variable is. I always work backwards. So what is it you're actually measuring? What is your dependent variable, or one of your dependent variables on your study? Go ahead and write that in. Who's graduating this spring? Brenda, you're not? You've been around for...
It's time for you to get out of here. Bye.
That came off really horribly, didn't it? I apologize.
I had this conversation yesterday.
When are you graduating?
May next year.
I knew that. What's your dependent variable that you're looking at?
Oh, my dependent variable. That's a good question.
Well, let me ask you this. Can dependent variables change from your very first framework? Yeah. Yeah. This is just your idea page. It doesn't matter what you put down on it. This is what you put down to get started talking with your advisors. What do you think is going to influence? Who has a dependent variable? Let's share. What's yours?
Well, I kind of have two. I have SAE knowledge
Okay.
for students. And then
Let's just focus on that one.
Okay.
SAE knowledge. What's your intervening variable?
We have, like, first their personal characteristics, how many classes they've taken, things like that. Independent variable, their classroom instruction related to SAE.
Do you have any conflicting variables, extraneous variables, any moderating variables? You know, there's,
I mean, there's a lot.
yeah.
That we.
And if you're studying those, you have to have those all, well, do you have to do it? Where do you get those from?
Some of those.
The answer is lit review.
Lit review, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, we looked at their participation in other activities.
If everybody on the planet says participating in FFA doesn't matter, and we know it would. But if everybody says that, would that still be a variable of interest?
And that's what we look to, just their SAE participation too, because that could affect what their knowledge is.
What is the title? Do you have a title for your study? Who's your advisor? Murphy, work with her on that.
She has an advisor. I would never.
We're just kidding. Yeah, but what's your dependent variable?
Degree of ethno-relativism or ethnocentrism.
Okay,
in,
what's your title
students.
of your study so far?
We're using Second Life as a experiential education.
So is Second Life the intervening variable? Or what's your variable of interest?
It'd be a Second Life simulation.
And again, this just gets you started. It's not perfect. And in fact, you can see that most of the models that we looked at don't end up looking like this. But allows you an opportunity to start talking. So I provide this as guidance for your title. Less than 12 words, no articles, prepositions. The most important thing is debate the value of each word. I know some folks have different opinions on that. I always get a kick out of going to graduation and listening to the dissertation titles from plant pathology and biochemistry and some of those things. You wonder if they're speaking the same language. And one of my concerns is the simplicity of what they do isn't, what we do in social sciences is much more complex. And yet we can explain our research so that people can understand it. If your titles are such that people can't even understand it, I question those. So I want to show you a couple of things that I've put on the website. So this one here is 29 different models. I'll go through them kind of fast, tell you what I think they are. This is just a research framework. This is probably a conceptual framework that deals with brain-based learning. It says up there, conceptual framework. Stacy Vincent's now at is it Kentucky? Yeah. Stacy's at Kentucky. He viewed his framework, his research framework, like a cell. I show you these because they don't all have to be boxes. They can be, so you'll see another one that's the spirals of a snail. If you look on our website under our faculty, almost all of our faculty have their research framework up there now. Jen Williams's is a tree. Mine's a cube. Others have other models. So there's no real rules except it needs to be somewhat clear and tell your story. Here's Stacy's other one, looking at a well-balanced ag program. All those things. That's probably a conceptual framework. Chris Ricketts, Penn State, right? No, she's at North Carolina State now, right? Yeah, NC State. And this is, she does her stuff in leadership, did a really good presentation last summer in Africa. And these are the kind of things she looks at. And here's the point, this is a conceptual model. She's not going to do all of this in every single study. But she may look in the youth area under this. She may look in the adult area. Last summer, she did this one with us, the international exposure, when she did the one with us. Here's Don Edgar, came from here. And he did his a little different. He put a lot of, this one could almost be theoretical. Why could I say this one could almost be theoretical? He has all these models. Here's the Burroughs model from communication that we use. You can see the Duncan and Biddle and so on around here. And he's saying all of these influence what he wants to study. And so I compliment Don. He's at Arkansas now. This is an interesting one, saying all of these things emerge from the bullseye on leadership. I'm going to look at these things. Tracy Kitchell, where's Tracy at? He's at Missouri now? Okay. He was at Kentucky at the time. And he's looking at this as a continuum, novice to expert. And so this is a very conceptual model. Again, this will be on what's shared for you. And you can look at these. Your style will dictate which type of model you're going to use. Some of you are going to love some of these, and some of you are going to say, "No, I'd never do that model." This one, Paula, she's now at like Delaware State, something like that. I saw her, but she was up at Coeur d'Alene last year with us at AAAE, and the colors didn't come through well on this one, but very, very inclusive of basically what you'd have in a proposal on this one. Here's a conceptual model by Eric Kaufman. He's still up there at Virginia Tech. He looks at, but this is his, kind of his research map, if you will. Another one, Neil Knobloch. I'm not sure I like this personally. I don't like this one. I'm not sure how it all ties together, but it's very inclusive. Kevin Williams, he's up at West Texas, right? Did a very nice job on this one. Looking again at what are your decisions. There you can see very clearly what your dependent variable is. You can see your external influences and your other things. Does he study all of this every time? No. Is operational a little different? I wonder who that is. Dr. Chris. She had a nice framework looking at successful leadership. Here's Brian Warnick. This one was so impressive to his dean when he went back and showed this to his dean, that his dean asked him to do a workshop for all of the assistant professors at Utah State University, because he said, we don't do enough of this. And this is for the whole college. He says, look at this. This shows his research framework all the way through, and he might do just this part in a study, the motivation for persisting in the profession as an example, but it shows how it all fits. Tim, he's up at University of Wisconsin, River Falls. He's also, I think he was in charge of ATA conclave last year at National Convention. Good man. And again, this is a great research framework, but it also is indicative of what's wrong with Ag Ed. And why do I say that?
Where's the outcome?
What?
What's the outcome?
And we try to do it all. You know?
I was gonna say, it's not very focused, like there's so many different things that they are, I mean, they're related to the not.
Oh, come on now, that's good stuff.
Oh, don't say stuff.
Oh, that's right.
We eat that at the Dixie
But
Chicken.
I feel like if you can take one thing and dig and dig and dig into it, that's better than nitpicking at a bunch of little things.
But if somebody brought me this,
Deep versus
if you
wide.
brought me this, Lauren, I would say, very nice job. Now, this is the world. Where's your niche going to be?
Right.
What part of this?
I mean, 'cause I think 10 studies on CDE event management would be more beneficial than a study on one small study on each one of those things.
Hang on. Here's another style. This is more the kind of style that I look at. Here's Ryan Anderson. He's now at Iowa State. Was at Murray State at the time. Looking at the influences on student success. You can see that's kind of our 3 circles we added. This one didn't come through right on the transition. Travis Parks up at Cornell. Looking at, and this one, I'm not sure I like it as well as some of the others. But Kim Bella, she's now at Murray State. Right? So here's that snail shell, thinking that all these things kind of matter. Ann DeLay, she's out at Cal Poly. And again, we try to think we have to do it all. I'd like much rather have her say, I want to just look at this part of our profession. This was Chris Ricketts, Wendy Warner, now in North Carolina. Ed Franklin, John Ramsey, he's still up at Oklahoma State, right? And so on. And so these, all of these are going to be on that website as well. So you're going to have the PowerPoint that we just did, this little green questionnaire, all of these examples, and then what he doesn't show right here is the handout, the 23 page handout that also has this on it. It's gone pretty fast. What type of questions do you have before we adjourn? Is anybody going to have me on their committee now? Because I kept saying I don't want to hear that you don't have a framework, stuff like that. What clarifications do we need to make? Okay, very good. Thank you for letting me do that.
Dr.
It's
Elliot.
been fun.